Hello everyone, Trevor here, and welcome to part 2. Finally. EQ stands for equalization, and at their most basic, the EQ adjustments we make are changes in the volume level of specific zones or bands in the audio frequency spectrum. It allows us to highlight or enhance the most desirable and pleasing elements of a given audio signal and suppress the less desirable parts, which can otherwise muddy the sound or hold it back from sounding its best. Some of the most common purposes of EQ include removing subharmonic rumble, taming low-mid mud and mid-range boxiness, controlling sibilance, adding high-end shimmer or sizzle, or moving certain instruments out of the way of others in certain areas in either a static or dynamic fashion. Obviously, EQ can do more than just that, but these are some of the more common things you'll hear people discussing whenever EQ is mentioned. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's do a quick recap of what we learned in part 1 and check how the template is shaping up. First, we looked at how to plan our template by deciding on its purpose and who it's for, as well as choosing the template's layout. Next, we learned how to add our first instruments, how and why to select which available articulations will be used, how to import and use expression maps for articulation control during playback, and finally, we learned how to set up our instrument group tracks and how to route our effects via the sends to make sure the effect is audible on playback. Here's how the template looks now. I've added all major sections of the orchestra, splitting the woodwinds, brass, and strings into their respective long and short articulation divisions, and routed everything to their respective group tracks. You can also see I have some MIDI regions with a 2.5 bar motif I wrote to help demonstrate the sound of the template. For transparency, one other adjustment I made was to balance the volume of all instruments within both their respective sections and against all other sections in a manner consistent with real-world orchestral performances at the median dynamic. For those wondering what that means, I set the dynamics in the mod wheel and expression to half their max volume, or 64 out of 127. Doing so allows the instruments to blend and balance in a more natural and realistic way at their average volume, as the true dynamic peaks of each section of the orchestra are not equal to one another. For example, if you listen to the bridge of Khazad Dûm, composed by Howard Shore in the Fellowship of the Ring film, as the Fellowship theme kicks off the piece, the brass are basically the only thing you hear, with percussion just managing to sneak in behind them. The other sections are playing at fortissimo behind them, but because of how naturally loud the brass are when playing true forte, they completely overpower the rest of the orchestra. It's only when the brass stop to breathe or take rests in the music that you actually hear the rest of the orchestra clearly. This is the reality of the orchestra's natural balance of power, and respecting it will give your music a more realistic feel even when using VST libraries. Balancing them at their median ensures they have headroom for their true dynamic peaks in a more natural and believable way. Here's what the long articulations of the template sound like in tutti at half dynamics. Here's what the short articulations sound like in tutti at half dynamics. As you can hear, the orchestra sounds pretty good as is, but there are some things we can do to shape the sound of each section to really get the most out of them and create an even stronger and more pleasing result. Something we need to account for when considering our first EQ adjustments is a natural and inevitable side effect of instruments sharing sonic space, known as frequency buildup or frequency stacking. The more instruments you add, the more their respective frequencies will stack on top of each other during playback. And if too much of a particular frequency band is allowed to build up, it can start to dominate the mix and directly affect which areas of the spectrum we hear most clearly, thereby muddying our perspective on the overall music. Despite this phenomenon being inevitable, it's not necessarily a huge issue. For example, when I played the orchestra for both its long and short articulations just a moment ago, there was no processing on them, and the orchestra overall still sounded quite pleasant, even with this natural frequency buildup occurring. To sharpen and focus the sound in a musical way, we just need to use a bit of TLC in the EQ to move the problem areas out of the way. Before we get started on that, however, I'd like to address something important which is rarely, if ever, taught in the online space, particularly in areas and platforms like YouTube. There's a common misconception about EQ that it changes the tone of the instrument. If we want to get highly technical and philosophical about the definition of the word tone, then we can at least agree that this is partially true. However, a more factually accurate phrasing is that we're not changing or creating tone so much as sculpting and revealing the best of what's already present. The heart of the VST's true tone, just like any other real-world instrument, comes from the performer, or performers, whose instruments and performances were sampled for the VST library. Their fingers on the strings, their breath through the valve or reed, the exact instrument they were playing when recorded, the space they were recorded in, the temperature of the air in the space during the recording, and many other details and factors all wrapped up into what we now hear as the raw, unedited sound out of the box. If the VST's raw sampled sound sucks, no amount of EQ is going to save it. But, on the other hand, for high-quality VSTs that sound good out of the box, EQ is a way to gently nudge their best qualities forward, while the least pleasing qualities get nudged down and out of the way, making an already good sample sound great. With all this in mind, let's get started with adjusting the EQ for the woodwinds. First, I'll isolate the piccolo flute to demonstrate that natural frequency buildup I mentioned before in the subharmonic region. Take a look at the low end of this EQ curve. As you can see, there isn't a whole lot happening down there, but we can see a few small spikes in the region below the lowest fundamental note of the piccolo which is being played, indicating that there is some subharmonic content beginning to build. Despite how high-pitched the piccolo flute may be, even it's not immune to this phenomenon. A common beginner mistake for dealing with this low-end content, which I myself was very guilty of making for a long time, is to put a brick wall high-pass filter on it in an attempt to completely remove that content, like so. I'd like to advise against this. The low-end content is still part of the piccolo's natural identity as an instrument. If you're mixing for other music genres like pop, metal, hip-hop, etc., then brick wall high-pass filters definitely do have a place and are much more commonly seen. But, again, in an orchestral context, it's best to avoid this method in favor of two alternatives which can help keep this low-end content under control while still respecting its presence and purpose as acoustic information in the context of our mix. If we were to implement brick wall high-pass filters like this one across the orchestra, it would flatten and thin out the sound, as well as negatively impact the low end and rob the orchestra of a lot of its punch and power. So, instead of a brick wall high-pass filter, we're going to use one of two subtractive EQ methods to tame that content. The first is called a shelf, which looks like this. The second method is to use a high-pass filter with a more gentle curve like this one. Both methods retain the content, but work to suppress it, or fade it out in a more natural way, which helps to preserve all the best qualities of the instrument above that content, and also preserves the integrity of the overall mix much better. Let's take a look at the three flutes now, and see what they look like. There's that same low-frequency content we saw in the piccolo. However, like with the piccolo, we don't want to remove it so much as bring it under control. But it would be a bit of a pain if we had to do this at the instrument level, track by track. So, to save both time and CPU resources, one of the ways we can deal with this low-end content is to put a high-pass filter on the respective group track or bus that the instruments are all routed to. If we do, it's important to understand that we will have no individual control over these adjustments. You'll have to live with the change for the entire section, which is one of the few drawbacks of this method. Nevertheless, if we use track-based EQ on an instrument-by-instrument basis, we will have finer control at the cost of CPU resources for every additional EQ we open up on those tracks. A good practice for balancing this is using broad, shallow EQ adjustments at the group level to help tame universal or near-universal problem areas for the section as a whole, and leave any smaller, more surgical adjustments at the track level. Because the group EQ takes care of common problem areas, most of the time we won't need many, if any, adjustments at the track level. But if there ever is a need, then we absolutely have the breathing room to do that. For my template, I'll be using and relying primarily on group level EQ. So I'm going to isolate the entire woodwind section via the group track, and let's listen to them without EQ. Something of note is that EQ is not an exact science. My ears will likely tell me something different than your ears tell you. But what my ears do tell me is that the low-end content is just a bit too strong compared to the mid and high-range content. So that's where I'll focus my attention first. FabFilter Pro Q3 is my go-to EQ at the moment, but feel free to use whatever EQ plugins you have access to, as any of them will do the job. I'll start by creating a high-pass filter at around 10 to 15 Hz and slowly move it up until I start hearing it become destructive. Then, I'll back it off until I feel the intended effect of cleaning the low end without robbing it of its power has been achieved. Right about there sounds right to me. And one other small piece of advice is to avoid rounding up or down with your EQ. If it sounds right at 43.675 Hz or 46.982 Hz, just leave it there. Don't round up to 50 or down to 40. It might seem inconsequential given how close those numbers are to each other, but there's a reason your ears told you to stop where they did. Ignoring them and rounding up or down can have small but nevertheless impactful changes to your mix which you may not have otherwise intended. Next, I can hear some boxiness and honk which I'm not really enjoying in the low mid-range. So, let's find it and bring it under control. With FabFilter Pro Q3, there's a nifty solo feature via this little headphone icon which I can use to isolate only the frequencies that I'm currently adjusting. Take a look. Right about there sounds good to me. The boxiness is more or less gone, and I'm still hearing that mid-range warmth and presence that the woodwinds are so famous for. So, nothing destructive has taken place. Time to move on. The last thing I'd like to do is add a little bit of extra air to this whole section. So, I'm going to give it a gentle nudge with a high shelf. That sounds good. Let's hear a before and after. For just 3 adjustments, it's not an inconsequential difference. The best qualities of the winds are maintained, and a lot of that extra undesirable noise has been pushed down and out of the way. So, what's an important takeaway from all this? Well, as can be said for many things in life, less is often more. To reiterate an earlier point, we're not trying to remove frequencies or change the tone of the woodwinds. We're just giving them some TLC to coax the best of what they have to the surface. I'll repeat the same process with the brass, percussion, choir, and strings, and show you a before and after. Okay, I'm back. I took about a 20-minute break after my adjustments, which is something that I highly recommend you all do if you find yourself composing or mixing for any length of time. Your ears can very easily fatigue, and they need to rest to help you maintain perspective with what you're doing. For the brass, the EQ curve looks like this. Just like for the woodwinds, I applied a high-pass filter to help tame that subharmonic rumble, applied 2 bell cuts that are relatively small, given that the window is at 12 dBs per octave, and gave it a gentle high shelf to push some of the brightness of the brass into the spotlight. Here's a before and after. That is a pretty significant difference if you ask me. Let's look at the percussion next. These curves are for the drums, cymbals and tam-tams, unpitched, woods, and metals. Let's hear a before and after. This one's a bit more subtle in full context, but there is nevertheless a change in the low-mid range where some muddiness had been gathering prior to the adjustment. Other than that, not a whole lot was needed here. Next, the piano and harp. Here are their EQ curves, and here's a before and after. Again, very subtle. The piano and harp have ultra-wide note ranges, and I tend to use less EQ on them to help preserve as much of their entire range and quality as possible. But, like everything else, this is subjective. So if you feel you want, or if your ears are telling you that you need stronger adjustments for your piano and harp tracks, then feel free to do whatever it takes to achieve the results you're after. Now, let's look at the choir. Here's their EQ curve, and here's a before and after. Finally, let's look at the strings. Here's their EQ curve, and here's a before and after. Now, let's listen to all of it in full context with a before and after for the whole orchestra. In terms of creating clarity and a bit of extra brightness, I would definitely say our adjustments made a difference, and one I'm honestly very happy with. This brings us to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this lesson on EQ, and that you're ready to use your ears to guide you forward with applying EQ to your own tracks and templates. I will see you in part 3, where we'll take a look at reverb and compression, as well as basic sidechaining techniques to unlock even more of our template's potential. See you there.